Believe it or not, both manga and anime were originally inspired by Western and more specifically, American animation. Between the 1930s and 50s, Walt Disney's animations and the way their characters were drawn with big eyes directly influenced the way anime features were and still are drawn. And since then, the pendulum has only swung back in favor of anime, especially in the early 2000s with shows like Dexter's Lab, Samurai Jack, Teen Titans, and Ben 10. Many Western animated series have now been inspired by Eastern animation. Shows like Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, and more recently Death Note and Naruto have been taken from one way or another. All this to say that Chainsaw Man is no different. Not only has Chainsaw Man been inspired by tons of Western media, like South Park and Adventure Time, but it has also inspired its own set of anime, like Dandadan and Hell's Paradise, both of whose creators directly worked under Chainsaw Man author Tatsuki Fujimoto. So in today's video, I'm gonna take you on a trip through the history of some of Chainsaw Man's biggest inspirations, and give you a new perspective on Western animation.
This is Boomerang from Cartoon Network.
Starting all the way back in 1938, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, or MGM, had an animation unit that quietly became one of the most influential forces during the golden age of animation. This was the era where cartoons weren't just filler before movies. They were the event. Out of this studio came icons, Tom and Jerry redefining slapstick chaos, Droopy delivering deadpan comedy before it was even really a thing, and the wild, almost unhinged energy of Tex Avery pushing the limits of what animation could be. And right in the middle of all that, two names that didn't seem special at the time, but would go on to shape everything that came after. William Hanna and Joseph Barbera. They weren't just co-workers, they were collaborators in the truest sense, the kind of partnership where one instinctively understands the other, where ideas don't need to be fully explained, they just click. And for years, they worked inside MGM's system, refining their craft, learning what worked, what didn't, and most importantly, what audiences already connected with. But like a lot of things in entertainment, stability doesn't last forever. When MGM made the decision to shut down its animation unit, it didn't just end a studio, it pulled the rug out from under everyone working there. Suddenly, Hanna and Barbera weren't part of something, they had to be something. And instead of fading out, like many others from that era, they took a risk. They built something of their own from the ground up. That gamble turned into the Raph and Reddy Show, a show that on the surface feels simple, but underneath it represents a shift, a transition from theatrical animation to television, from big budget spectacle to something more sustainable, more consistent, and honestly, more personal. And once that door opened, they didn't stop. What followed was a run that's honestly kind of ridiculous when you look at it in hindsight. The Huckleberry Hound Show, Yogi Bear, show after show that didn't just succeed, they defined what TV animation was. And as the studio officially became Hanna-Barbera, it started pulling in talent from everywhere. Former Disney animators, industry veterans, and people who understood the old system but were now adapting to something entirely new. And that's really the key here. Hanna-Barbera wasn't just making cartoons, they were reinventing how cartoons were made. Limited animation, reused assets, and faster production cycles. Things that might sound like shortcuts, but in reality, they were innovations, necessary ones, because television wasn't the same as theaters. It demanded consistency over perfection, and somehow, they made it work. For decades, they went on a run that most studios could only dream of. The Flintstones brought animation into prime time like it had never done before. Scooby-Doo Where Are You? Turning mystery solving into something every kid grew up with. And even outside their own original creations, their involvement with properties like the Smurfs just solidified how dominant they really were. But eventually, like every era, things shifted. In 1991, Turner Broadcasting System, or TBS, stepped in and acquired Hanna-Barbera, along with its massive catalog of animation. And this wasn't just a business move, it was a turning point, because not long after, something new was born out of that library, something that would carry the legacy forward in a completely different way: Cartoon Network. A channel built on the idea that cartoons could run all day every day, no longer confined to specific time slots or treated as secondary content. This was animation 24/7, a direct pipeline from the past into the future. At first, it leaned entirely on what Hanna-Barbera had already created, but that only lasted so long because eventually it had to find its own voice. And that started with The Moxie Show, an early experiment that felt like the network trying to figure itself out in real time. And then things started to click. New creators came in. new ideas started forming, and suddenly you had a wave of shows that didn't just build on Hanna-Barbera's legacy, they evolved it. Dexter's Laboratory, Samurai Jack, both were led by Genndy Tartakovsky, someone who clearly understood the foundation laid before him, but wasn't afraid to push it further. And that's really what this whole history comes down to. It's not just about one studio or two creators, or even a single era of cartoons. It's about how each generation builds on the last, how something started in a small animation unit in 1938 ends up shaping an entire network and an entire culture decades later. Early Cartoon Fridays, and the era of old Cartoon Network in general, was filled with creators and artists consistently bouncing between projects, carrying ideas and inspirations from one show to another. A lot of people who would go on to define Western animation in the 2000s all somehow crossed paths during this period. For example, Johnny Bravo was notable for having both Seth MacFarlane and Butch Hartman working on it as writers and storyboard artists long before either of them became household names. Another major example is Craig McCracken, who not only created Powerpuff Girls, but would later go on to create Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends and Wander Over Yonder as well. All this really highlights how animation exists in this giant creative spiderweb, where one generation directly inspires the next. These creators grew up with older cartoons, took ideas from them, reinvented them, and unknowingly became the inspiration for future creators themselves. Without shows from this era, we likely would have never gotten The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack, which famously helped keep Pendleton Ward employed long enough for him to eventually create Adventure Time. And in a weirdly unexpected way, Adventure Time itself would go on to become one of Chainsaw Man's biggest inspirations. The influence didn't stop there either, because eventually, many of the artists and crew members who worked on Adventure Time would openly express their love for Chainsaw Man, and even use it as inspiration for their own later projects. The cycle just keeps continuing. It's no secret that Chainsaw Man's story and the relationship between Denji and Pochita share a lot of similarities with Adventure Time, and the bond between Finn and Jake, but that's really only scratching the surface of what inspired the series. Adventure Time is far from Chainsaw Man's only influence, and those inspirations don't just stop at animation either. Tatsuki Fujimoto wears his love of film on his sleeve to an almost obsessive degree. Throughout the manga, there are constant references to movies, directors, framing techniques, and scenes directly inspired by some of his favorite films. Chainsaw Man often feels less like a traditional manga and more like someone translating their entire media diet directly onto the page. Since the ending of the series, Fujimoto has openly stated that The Big Lebowski was one of his main inspirations behind Chainsaw Man's conclusion, and more specifically, he connected with the idea that despite everything the main character goes through, the larger plot itself is ultimately meaningless. Life just kind of keeps moving regardless, but the parallels between the film and Denji's story may go deeper than Fujimoto initially lets on, because the journey of the dude shares an almost weirdly specific overlap with Denji himself. The film follows the dude, otherwise known as Jeffrey Lebowski, an unemployed and financially struggling man who spends his days bowling and trying to get by. The entire story begins because a man breaks into his apartment and urinates on his rug, sending the dude down a bizarre spiral involving crime, manipulation, violence, and people far more powerful than him. What starts as something small and almost comedic slowly turns into a larger mess that he never really asked to be a part of in the first place. Along the way, he learns who he can trust, who he can't, and the importance of the relationships he's built with the people around him. By the end of the film, after losing one of his closest friends to senseless violence, the dude ultimately returns to the simple thing that brought him comfort from the very beginning: bowling. In a lot of ways, that's what Denji's story eventually becomes too. After all the chaos, trauma, death, and world-ending stakes, what he truly wanted deep down was always something painfully simple. At the end of all of this, what makes Chainsaw Man so fascinating is that it's the product of nearly a century of creative cross-pollination. A manga inspired by Western films, Western cartoons inspired by anime originally inspired by Western animation, and creators constantly borrowing, remixing, and reinterpreting what came before them. From Hanna-Barbera to Cartoon Network, from Adventure Time to The Big Lebowski, every road somehow leads here, and that's what art has always been. Not copying, but conversation. One creator speaking to another across decades, genres, and even continents. Tatsuki Fujimoto didn't just take from his inspirations. He transformed them. He stitched them together, pieces of everything he loved, and made something that feels entirely his own. And now, Chainsaw Man has entered that same cycle. It's no longer just something that's inspired by others. It's become the thing inspiring whatever comes next. That's the real legacy of art. Nothing is created in a vacuum, but somehow, through all that influence, something new is always born. Thank you for watching.